Here's something that gets buried in every conversation about the economy. Economists have a specific name for the era that gave birth to the American middle class. They call it the Great Compression. And they don't study it as a model to replicate. They study it as an anomaly to explain. That word matters. An anomaly. Not a template, not a baseline. A one-time event. Because here's what the data actually shows. The version of middle-class life that millions of Americans grew up believing was normal, the house, the pension, the single income, the upward mobility, that world existed for roughly 30 years. It was held together by a specific, unrepeatable collision of war, policy, and a global economy that had been blown apart. When those conditions disappeared, the middle class started disappearing with them.
This isn't a political argument. It's a structural one. And once you see it, the question stops being what went wrong. It becomes something harder to sit with. What if nothing went wrong? What if this is just what things look like when the accident is over? To understand why this matters, start with a single image. Levittown, Long Island, 1947. 17,000 nearly identical homes, going up at a pace of one every 16 minutes. Veterans returning from the war could buy one for $7,990, roughly $100,000 in today's money. No down payment required if you had a GI Bill. One income, one breadwinner, a yard, a car, a television, a pension waiting at the end of 40 years. That image became the mental picture of American normalcy, the thing you were supposed to be able to reach if you worked hard enough.
Now look at what that same life costs today. The median home price in the United States is somewhere between $330,000 and $495,000. Healthcare costs roughly $13,000 per person per year, 4 to 5 times higher in real terms than in 1970. College tuition has risen 2 to 4 times faster than inflation. And the CEO to worker pay ratio, which sat at 31 to 1 in 1978, now sits at 281 to 1. This isn't a story about inflation. These essentials have risen far faster than inflation. They've risen faster than wages. They've risen faster than almost everything except the wealth of people who don't need them to be affordable. So what happened? To understand this, you have to go back further than most people do. The mid-century middle class didn't grow out of a healthy, functioning capitalism. It grew out of the wreckage of 2 world wars, a global depression, and a set of emergency policies that were never meant to be permanent. Here's the sequence. The Great Depression destroys corporate power and legitimizes redistribution. World War II follows immediately, and with it comes something called the National War Labor Board, a government body that controls wages, encourages unionization, and compresses pay differences across industries and regions. By the time the war ends, the wage structure of the entire American economy has been flattened in ways that would have been politically impossible under normal conditions. Then the GI Bill hits. Millions of veterans get subsidized college, vocational training, and home loans. Union membership climbs. Top marginal tax rates reach 90%. The federal government commits to managing unemployment as a policy priority. And here's the global piece that almost never gets mentioned in these conversations. After World War II, Europe and Asia are in ruins. The United States is the only major industrial economy left intact. American factories are supplying the world. High-wage, unionized manufacturing jobs stay profitable, not because of some enlightened corporate philosophy, but because there's no global competition to undercut them. Economists Claudia Golden and Robert Margo documented what this period actually looked like in the wage data. The gap between the highest and lowest earners compressed sharply between 1940 and 1950. It was one of the fastest and most dramatic reductions in inequality ever recorded. And then, just as sharply, it reversed. By 1985, the gap had reopened to roughly where it stood in 1940. That reversal isn't a coincidence. It's a consequence. There's a concept in economics called the Great Decoupling. It refers to the moment when worker productivity and worker wages stopped moving together. For most of the post-war period, they tracked closely. When workers produced more, they earned more. That relationship was the mechanical engine of the middle class. It turned economic growth into broadly shared prosperity. That relationship broke in the mid-1970s. Since 1979, U.S. labor productivity has risen by somewhere between 60 and 70%. Real median wages have risen by about 10 to 15%. That gap, productivity going one direction, wages going another, is not a rounding error. It's a structural fracture. And 3 things drove it. The first is deindustrialization. Manufacturing employment in the United States fell from roughly 25 to 30% of all jobs in the 1950s to under 10% today. Those jobs weren't just jobs. They were the specific kind of jobs that built the middle class. High productivity, accessible without an advanced degree, unionized, and structured around wage compression. When they left, what replaced them was a polarized service economy. High-skill, high-wage jobs at the top, low-wage, low-security jobs at the bottom, and a shrinking band in the middle. Economists call this job polarization, the missing middle. The second is automation. Early waves of automation in the 1970s and 80s hit routine manual work, assembly lines, clerical roles, bookkeepers. But the more recent wave reaches into cognitive labor, customer service, basic legal work, data processing,
Entry-level analysis. The jobs that once anchored white-collar middle-class stability are now directly exposed to substitution in ways they weren't 20 years ago. The third is global labor arbitrage. When firms can offshore production to lower-wage countries or outsource services digitally across borders, domestic workers stop being the only option. They become the expensive option. Union membership, which sat at roughly 24% of the workforce in the late 1970s, now sits below 10%. Workers who once had institutional leverage to claim a share of productivity gains no longer have it. The leverage moved to capital. Thomas Piketty spent years building an argument around a single inequality. When the rate of return on capital exceeds the rate of economic growth, wealth concentrates. Naturally, predictably, without anyone orchestrating it. His conclusion about the mid-century was blunt. The reduction in inequality during that period was, in his words, largely the result of shocks and policies that are unlikely to recur automatically. The wars destroyed accumulated capital. The Depression discredited it. The policies redistributed it. None of those forces are waiting in reserve. Joseph Stiglitz makes a complementary argument from a different angle. He points to the policy choices made after the 1970s. Deregulation, tax cuts at the top, weakened labor protections, capital mobility, and argues that the rules of the global economy were deliberately rewritten in ways that favor owners of capital over earners of wages. The outcomes we're seeing aren't market forces operating neutrally. They're market forces operating within a specific institutional framework that was redesigned in the 1980s. Put these two arguments together and you get something uncomfortable. The post-war middle class was produced by an anomalous set of historical conditions, and the policies that tried to preserve it were systematically dismantled before most people realized what they were protecting. There's a common rebuttal to all of this worth taking seriously. The argument goes, households today own more than households in the 1950s. More cars, bigger TVs, smartphones, air conditioning. The material standard of living has risen, even if wages have stagnated. Cheaper goods, especially consumer electronics, mean that middle-class life is in many ways richer than it's ever been. That's true, and it matters less than it looks like it does. A cheaper television doesn't substitute for a more expensive house. A smartphone doesn't offset a healthcare bill. Better consumer goods don't close the gap between what college costs now and what it cost in 1970. The things that got cheaper are, for the most part, the things that were already discretionary. The things that got more expensive are the ones that define structural security. The roof over your head, the doctor you can see, the credential that gets you in the door. There's also something worth naming in the data about lifestyle creep. The pattern where income rises, spending rises with it, and the gap between earnings and financial security stays flat. Some of the financial pressure households feel reflects higher expectations and consumption norms. That's real. But even after you account for it, the underlying costs of housing, healthcare, and education have outpaced income growth in ways that aren't explained by buying more stuff. The modern middle class is, in a precise sense, richer in consumption and poorer in stability. It has more things and less security, more options and less margin. Here's what all of this builds toward. The story most people tell about the middle class is a story of decline, a golden era followed by a fall. But that framing assumes the golden era was the baseline, that it represented what a healthy economy naturally produces, and that we've drifted away from it. The evidence doesn't support that framing. Historically, advanced capitalist economies concentrate wealth. That's not a moral judgment, it's what the data shows across centuries. The mid-century was the exception, a 30-year window when a specific combination of forces briefly reversed that tendency. Wars that destroyed accumulated capital, emergency policies that weren't designed to last,
A global economy where the United States had no serious competition. Union density that gave workers institutional leverage they haven't had before or since. When those forces dissolved, through Reconstruction, through globalization, through automation, through deliberate policy choices, the underlying tendencies of the system re-emerged. Piketty calls it a return to historical norms. What feels like decline is actually convergence. We're not falling from a peak. We're returning to where things were before the accident. That matters because it changes the question. The question isn't how to get back to the post-war model.
That model required conditions that no longer exist and can't be recreated. The question is whether any combination of policy and institutional design can produce broadly shared prosperity inside a global, automated, service-driven economy. Conditions the post-war era never had to solve for. Nobody has a clean answer to that, but it starts with being honest about what we're actually dealing with. The middle class wasn't capitalism's natural output. It was a 30-year exception to capitalism's natural output. And the first step toward building something durable is understanding what we actually lost and why.